I'm so delighted to be back again today with William, whom I met at the Chino conference. And while we're on the subject of conferences, I did just want to mention that I'll be speaking at the Pacific Northwest Estuary Conference in September in Olympia, Washington. And I'll put the information about that in the description section below for those who want to participate. You might give a little word about what the Chino conference meant to you, William, so that maybe it will inspire people to go to the Estuary Conference in Olympia.
Yeah. I'm starting a new job in July, and so I don't know if I'll be able to make that one. If I could guarantee the time off, I would have already signed up, actually, because Estuary Chino was the first time that I stepped out from behind the screen and actually met people. I was blessed to not have to travel, so it helped make it a little bit easier for me financially to go to that conference because I live in the Los Angeles area. And so I drove, but from the first day, the first morning before the first speaker, the way that one was organized, we got together in an estuary group. We got together and spoke with about 10 people, and I was impressed immediately by just how easy it was to talk to people, and how open and willing people were to engage. And the whole event, the way that it was structured with time together in groups, and then the speakers themselves, and just the mix of it all was just a huge blessing to me. It's where I met Karen, which I have really appreciated, continuing to know her, even in a small way or since. And it helped as a form of participation. It was doing something, and that alone, the act of doing it was also something that had impact and kind of affected the way that it was a developmental step for me. So no, it was a wonderful thing. And I mean, I think it would be wonderful. I mean, like I said, I would be there already signed up if I could guarantee that I can take the time off. So we'll see.
Yeah, well, I know for some people the traveling is a little bit of a lurch in the system, but
Yeah.
It will be set up exactly the same way. It's going to start with the small groups before the speakers start, and then there'll be speaker, and then the two speakers will talk, and then there'll be some panel discussions, and it's going to be a great mix of speakers. I'll put all that information in the description section, but it includes a biodynamic farmer and a sheep farmer, and they do other things as well besides those things, right?
Yeah.
And then a poet.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's going to be a really interesting mix of people, and it's hosted by Nate Heil of Grail Country.
Yep.
And so he's very good at bringing people together. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah.
So, well, let's get started today. You had an idea about speaking about specificity in language, and I thought I would let you get started so you could explain it since it's your topic.
Yeah, so this is something that I've been working on by myself and then in conversation with people that I know for several years now. It's an idea that I have become more and more convinced is important, which is that our normal mode should be to strive to be as specific with our language as is possible given the arena that we find ourselves in. And I do say normal mode because there are exceptions where it's not appropriate. When you're like playing a game, or you're hanging out, or you're doing things that are not in a mode of kind of earnestness, but in a mode of play, it changes. But in our work, in our kind of relating to our family members or the people that we live with, and in our communication, even with ourselves, specificity in language is really important. And there's a couple of different reasons why I have become convinced of this. One of them is that language to some extent preforms your thoughts. So if you use a certain type of language, it will affect the way that you think and the way that your thinking and emotions follow. And an easy example of this that anyone who's been married or has gone through or seen anyone else go through marriage counseling is the always or nevers. When people say, well, you always leave the dirty dishes in the sink, or you never take the trash out, or you insert a superlative and an issue here, it changes the way that you think about those things. It makes it bigger than it is, when most often it would be more accurate and more specific to say that it's often the case that, or you often, or you very rarely. And what that does is it's being more specific. It's being more truthful, actually. I think that one of the ideas that specificity in language has connected with for me is the idea of truthfulness and being living and acting in a mode that is true. And exaggeration is something that is kind of antithetical to that, and something that I think is worth avoiding. Now, of course, I'm speaking generally. There are places where exaggeration is appropriate. You're hyping up your friends, or you're trying to get somebody excited to do something, and you just say, you can absolutely go for it, do it, you're the best. There's a place for those types of things. We're returning to just the idea of being generally speaking with more specificity. The other place, so that's like one set of examples. Another set of examples, I think, where it's very helpful actually is in talking about things from a Christian perspective, and in the church in particular. I think that we'll say things like, the results don't matter for what you do, just be faithful and do the thing. And it's like kind of true, but it's not really true. It's better to say the results of your actions when you're trying to be faithful don't ultimately matter. They are not of ultimate importance. The thing that is of ultimate importance is God and his glory, and living out a life that is following after him. The results can be trusted to God, but they do matter because they have an impact on your life. They have consequences in your relationships. They have an impact on your church. And so taking the time to add an adjective sometimes, or to take things from full absolutes and into more accurate kind of proportional reality when we describe them, is one of the biggest examples of what I'm talking about when I talk about specificity of language. And why I think it's really important is because it affects the way that we think. And sometimes things that we think are implicit are better. It's better to take the time to say them, because not everyone can always read the implicit. Now, once again, explicit and implicit, there's place for both, and they're appropriate. But, though I think those are some examples that kind of point at what I'm talking
What immediately comes to mind is Jordan Peterson's chapter, I think it's in Beyond Order, might be in the first book, I'm not sure, about don't leave things in the fog.
Yeah.
And he explains a lot of different aspects of being in the fog. Sometimes a person is in the fog because they themselves don't yet know who they are.
Yeah.
Maybe they grew up in a household where they weren't given the opportunity to develop their own thoughts and ideas and personalities. And maybe they, were under a lot of trauma, and therefore they're sort of living in the fog, and they need someone to maybe help them out of the fog. And maybe one way that we could do that is to encourage more specificity when they say something, because I have talked to some people who will say very broad stroke things, and they say it in a way that indicates that they expect that what they're saying is obvious,
right,
that everybody should understand. And yet what they're saying is so just with a big broad brush, and there's no way to really know exactly what they're getting at. You can't hone in on anything.
Yeah.
Which I find myself doing that sometimes. I'll say something, maybe hoping that people don't hone in on it, because I'm not really sure what's behind it or under it, right?
Yeah.
And especially, I think it happens quite a bit in the little corner when we get into some of these discussions where some people have so much deep knowledge about some line of philosophers or something,
Yeah.
and I don't know very much. And so I'll say something which makes sense to me, but it's certainly not in the same vein of what they're talking about. And if they drilled down on me, I wouldn't have anything specific to say about it. So
Yeah.
I do think that that can come up when you leave things in the fog. And another aspect of leaving things in the fog is that you can lose your way
Mm-hmm.
very easily. You can start an idea and then you can't, if language preforms our thinking, then the only way that we can think clearly is to use the kind of language that forces us to see the path in front and keep moving forward on that
Yeah.
path. Where if you're lost in the fog and stumbling around with your language like I am right now,
No, well, yeah. Yeah.
you can lose your way. And
Yeah.
so I do think that this issue of specificity is pretty important.
Yeah, and there's like a few things too beyond which are like in like language, it's not just made up. There's real concepts, there are real things that exist that language is pointing to. The language doesn't make those things real. It allows us to know them more better or draw it closer to them. And like there are things that we can kind of like have an idea of, but then language lets us know them more or better. It's similar in a similar way to how when you can name a spirit, then you have a much better handle on what its like boundaries are, its limits are. And part of the way that I kind of came to think of this actually, and part of my development of this idea came from actually learning Spanish, because I started working in an environment where many of my coworkers only spoke Spanish. And so I, had a couple of years of high school Spanish. I did not speak Spanish, and I spent a couple of years really learning. And one of the things that ends up happening when you learn another language is that sometimes like one word in English might have multiple words in Spanish, or one word in Spanish might have multiple words in English, or for some languages, there's words that don't actually have a representative word in the other languages, in other languages. And one of the things that it reveals is like Paul has used this example because he speaks Spanish, but in Spanish, we talk about Vervaeke's four P's of knowing, but Spanish already goes from one knowing to two, because you have saber and conocer, which is to know about something and then to know in a relational manner, but for the two things. And so already there, you're able to be more specific in Spanish as a default mode about the type of knowing that you're doing beyond what you can do in English. And it's a nice example. But I think you're right too for the fog. And I think, sometimes when people are in conversation, or even I think, for myself, at least sometimes when I get stuck in my own head and I'm thinking through things and not sure where to go, forcing specificity upon myself can help me to be more honest about where it is that I truly am. And I think in relationship, it's really good to help other people and try and draw out specificity, because it can reveal a place where, you know, you, to try and set those boundaries in the relationship, like about the idea itself that they're working on. But I think too, sometimes, like at least in a relational sense, there has to be a time where you don't push too hard. One of the funny things that happens, because I focus on this, and then the people around me, like my family members in particular, but even some of my friends, they'll see me, like they'll say something, and then my eyes will go up like this, and I'll start thinking. And I'm thinking, is that the way that I would have said it, or would I have said it slightly differently? Because then I'll suggest to them if I find it appropriate. Do you mean maybe this, and it's a slightly more specific formulation? And so now I have several friends who they'll look at me when they say something, and they'll stop and they'll re-say it themselves with more specificity. And it just, it's, at first I was very self-conscious about it, because I was like, well, am I just like a bully? but I came to realize that it's something that is appreciated, and so it's been kind of fun. But there has to be time to also leave it alone. You know what I mean? It can't be always on, or else you'll just exhaust yourself. Because one of the things about it is it takes more effort. It takes more mental energy. It takes more intentionality in order to change some of these patterns of language that we just have received from the culture that we've grown up in, from the types of, shows and everything that's around us all the time, and the way that other people speak.
Well, so a couple of things come up for me.
Mhm.
One is, when you're talking about this, do you think it's in the same vein as when Peterson talks about training yourself to speak only the truth or to not lie? Because to only speak those things where you sense your own strength, instead of wandering off into areas where you start to feel weak. And then he says, then don't say those things.
Yeah.
Is that kind of the same
I
thing?
think it's absolutely related to that idea. One of the things that has come in my own kind of patterns of communication is that um, if I'm going to say something where my confidence level or my certainty is really low because I'm not very sure, it's just kind of an idea or that's kind of coming in the moment or something else, I will almost always preface it. I'll say, I don't say this with any high degree of certainty, but maybe it's something like this. And that's kind of the way that I'll lead into something where I'm not really sure. And I think it is, I mean, as I first started with, I really do think it's really connected to the idea of truth. And then truth and knowing are almost inseparable concepts, because true things, at least in the sense of corresponding to reality as we experience it, have to be things that we know. Like, you can't be truthful without knowing the thing that you're saying. Of course, there are the other senses of true, like actually, I think Jordan Hall laid out really well, which is like the trueness of an arrow that's flying true and things like that, which have a different meaning, but they're related in at least some sense. That's why they use the same words. But no, I think it's very much related to the idea of tell the truth, or at least don't lie. And that in that part of what it does is I have become less and less comfortable saying things that aren't true, because then I'll second guess myself and I'll be like, well, but is that really the right way to say it? Is that really, and those are all different ways of kind of thinking through the question of, is it really true? So I think that it is definitely related to that for sure. And I think part of the benefit of it in relationship is when people know that you speak truthfully as your default mode, they can trust you more, because they're not always looking for us. And in this way too, if they know that you're going to be as explicit as you believe to be appropriate, they're not looking for the implicit meaning. They're not looking for the double meaning. They're not looking for what about this or what about that all the time, or at least not constantly. Um, and so, and that's not really like an on or off switch, of course. You know what I mean? It's like, it's a thing that happens more or happens less. So it happens less. Um, and then it's encouraging of kind of deeper relationship, right? Because that can afford trust. Um, and that's definitely something that I have experienced in some of my relationships, where I've seen that being careful in the way that I speak, being specific with my language, has allowed for conversations and deepening of relationship with friends, that I think wouldn't have happened at the rate or to the degree that they happened otherwise.
Well, partly, I think, because I did my master's degree in linguistics and in teaching English as a second language.
Mm,
And I worked as a ESL teacher for a number of years. And then later, I worked as an intercultural consultant looking at the differences between cultures, not just language differences, but behavior, body language, attitude, all those kinds of things. So partly because of that, when I hear two people talking, I can often, even if they're the same language, I mean, this happens frequently when there's people of two different languages, but even if they're the same language, but maybe they're different kinds of people, different personalities or different cultural backgrounds or whatever, I can understand each of them, but they are not understanding each other.
yeah.
And so I find myself sometimes getting in there and saying, well, I think that what he's saying is this.
Yeah.
I think that what you're saying is that. And is that true? You know, and
Yeah.
then they'll say, yes, yes. And then they can understand each other. And I
Yeah.
find myself doing this kind of interpreting quite frequently. And I don't know if that's irritating to people or
Yeah.
helpful to people.
Yeah.
One
Or
of the
probably both.
Yeah, in equal measure. One of the things that I learned in my work in intercultural consulting was a format that they used. It has a rather unfortunate acronym, DIE, but not the same as diversity, equity, inclusion, but
Yeah.
it's description, interpretation, evaluation. And you
Yeah.
do it in that order. And it's intended to build trust between people of two different cultures. And here's how it works. So as an example, we used to train young Japanese college graduates in how to work in an American company. You know, they have cultural behaviors that create a lot of misunderstanding. And so do we. We have cultural behaviors that create a lot of misunderstanding. But we would use this DIE format to help them understand the American culture. So they come over here and they would live for often, let's say 18 weeks or 24 weeks. We would help them get apartments, get set up in their apartments. We would teach them how to shop in American grocery stores and how to order in American restaurants and all of that kind of thing. And then we would act as cultural informants for them. So when there was something they didn't understand, they could come and talk to us. So we always ask them, before you fly off the handle and get upset about something, come and talk to us first, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the trainees came to me one day and said, Americans are slobs. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Could you tell me more? Could you describe to me what gave you that idea? So the description was that he went to the laundry room and an American was doing 2 loads of laundry in the big washing machines in the laundry room. And so then I have to get an interpretation for that because that doesn't say anything to me, right? Does it say anything to you? They're doing
No, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, in the interpretation, he says, in Japan, we do a load of laundry every day. We would never let laundry build up
to
for a week.
pile up to have to.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
You let the laundry pile up for a week in your closet. That's disgusting.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the interpretation.
Yeah.
So then comes the evaluation from my side. Well, hopefully it should be A and then B and then AB coming together. So in the evaluation, I explained, I said, well, I lived in Japan for 3 years and I did my laundry every day in Japan. But the reason I did my laundry every day in Japan is that the washing machine is about this big. It only holds like 2 towels and a t-shirt, maybe that, or 1 towel and 2 t-shirts, maybe that's it. So you do the laundry every day. I said, in the United States, we have large washing machines, so there's no need to do the laundry every day. And we can save water and save electricity by only running 1 load a week or 2 loads a week. Oh, that never occurred to him. See? So right out the gate, you see that people make judgments based on what they think is obvious.
Yeah.
Right? But if you can get them to describe, have a description
Mhm.
which you were saying that in your mind, there's a difference between a description and a definition. And I think
Yeah.
it would be very interesting to explore.
Yeah. Well, and also I have a really particular idea of what it means for something to be obvious that I've tested against with some people in conversation and they found that it's held up. But so I had this idea in my head that descriptions and definitions have to be different than each other. Otherwise, why do we have two words?
Mhm.
That's not always the case. You know, sometimes words do converge and have the same meaning or develop, you know, there's different ways that can happen. But I was just like, I was thinking about it, and basically, the way that I kind of, partly because of, you know, going to engineering school and like remembering doing proofs, and then also in like in engineering, like in college, when you're doing an engineering problem, you always you set your assumptions at the start. So you get all your givens, and then you lay out like what equations you think you're going to do, and you're like saying that these are all of the things that I'm starting with, and then you work with them as they are, as you're kind of working towards your answer. And that is basically it. And then another example of that actually is in technical papers for any discipline really. You'll oftentimes like have a glossary or something at the beginning where it says this word will mean this specific definition for the remainder of this paper. Every time that you read this word, it has this specific meaning. Um, and those all in my mind are definitions. And what a definition is, in the way that I understand it, is something that exhausts the meaning of the word. So a definition exhausts the meaning. It accounts for all of the meaning that the word has in the context where it's being applied. And so then if you're going to make a universal definition, then a universal definition would exhaust all of the meaning universally for some sort of word. And I think that
Could you give me
and
an example of a word and a definition that exhausts the meaning of the word?
yeah. So an easy one is like a bachelor. A bachelor is an unmarried man. There is never an opportunity or an instance where a bachelor is not an unmarried man. It's always that, and that's the extent of what it is. It isn't more than that. Any one bachelor might be more than that, but being a bachelor is that thing. Whereas a description is something that's true about someone or something or a word, depending on the exact usage, but it's not exhaustive. And an example of that, um, you know, when you're describing a person, well, let me think actually if I have a good example of a concept that works that way. Trying to think. This is something that I just kind of I worked through and then I filed it and then I have it, but examples aren't always as easy. Hmm. I think mostly I use description when I'm talking through concepts with people and I'm not sure that we've fully figured it out. So I think probably for love, we can only give descriptions, but not definitions. I don't think we can ever fully exhaust what love is. We can read 1 Corinthians 13 and see that love is patient and love is kind, and it does not remember wrongs and it seeks the other's good and all of these things. But I think at the end of the day, love is still more than all of those things. So I think that it's mostly helpful. So I think that the broader things become, the less we are able to define them and the more we're able to describe them. And part of the reason why I think it's useful to have two, because you could just say, well, we're defining it as this, and it means that we're giving some meaning to it, right? But coming back to specificity in language, part of the reason for me that it's helpful to have two words is because if it's defined, then it's a type of thing that is known, where there isn't more to it. Whereas if it's being described, then it's something that we can know and we know things about, but there's still more. And so then you would relate to those two different types of things differently, as like, or I would relate to those two types of things differently. And so that's like a good explanation. And I think actually going back to the example that you gave, where just he didn't really understand this young Japanese gentleman. I think that that's just so funny. And I think that the define is good because you're like laying out what you mean and then going forwards from there. But I also think, well, anyway, it was let me stop there and say, does that kind of hold?
I mean, it brings up a lot of things in my mind, and one of them is that I before we got on the call, I was thinking about your idea that definition and description are different.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking that in some ways, a definition draws a boundary,
Yes, a
making
hard boundary.
right? It's making something different than everything else.
Yep.
It's making it a unique item. It's got a definition. Where a description can be almost a little bit like a story.
Mm-hmm.
And if I
Yeah.
think about it that way, it sort of slots into this binary that that I picked up from Owen Barfield in his book Speaker's Meaning, where he talks about these two sides being accuracy and expression.
Mm.
And accuracy would be more like a definition,
Mm-hmm.
and expression would be more like a description.
Oh, interesting.
So over here in the description side, you could even say that you could have both apophatic and cataphatic
Mm-hmm.
descriptions, right?
Yeah.
Is this, it isn't that.
Mm-hmm.
Where in a definition, you're being more accurate or more precise about where the boundaries are that separate this thing from that thing.
Yeah, it's exactly this, right? The boundary is, I'll say it doesn't have a solid boundary. It has for definitions, it does have a solid boundary. For descriptions and most things in life, it has fuzzy boundaries. The boundary, it's like, is it here or is it there? It's kind of somewhere around here. And it doesn't mean that we don't know at all where it is, but it means we don't know exactly where it is. And that's an important distinction, I think, for sure.
I think it might be like the difference between a photograph and a painting.
Yeah. What is the difference?
Well, I think that it is exactly that. A photograph this is specifically what was captured at this moment in time with hopefully perfect accuracy. Or a painting is a description of what is being seen, and that description is being filtered through the speaker.
Yes.
Through the speaker's mind, through the speaker's heart, through the speaker's experiences.
Yep.
And then it's coming out in this description. So
yeah,
a description would be really in some ways more of a not exactly sure how you would say it, but more like of a personal,
more personal. Yep. More relational.
Where a definition needs to be a little bit more universal, something you can put in a dictionary that everybody can agree on.
Yeah. And I think part of the reason why I like it too is because dictionaries are dumb. Like we need to have dictionaries because they're helpful for reference and things like that and for people learning. But people acting as if dictionaries tell you what words mean don't understand how dictionaries work. That's not what a dictionary does. Dictionaries tell you what people agreed that words meant at a time when the dictionary was written. And that's a different thing than telling you what words mean. Because words mean what they mean. And they mean what they mean in a context, in a relationship, for a particular person in a particular environment. And that's where, you know, what specificity is can look very differently depending on who it is that you're talking to, or whether you're at work, or whether you're at church, or whether you're you know, at the bowling alley or at the local gaming store or whatever it is where you go regularly to hang out with people. What it means looks differently, but it's the same basic idea that's being instantiated. And I do think you're right. I think that descriptions are more personal, they're more relational in the way that I think of them. And it's not to say that definitions aren't useful, but it's I think it goes back a little bit to McGilchrist's concept of the emissary taking the place of the master, and the way that Paul calls it the scientific lab leak, where scientific thinking and quantity thinking and fully defining, and everything has boundaries and everything is perfectly understood and exhaustively understood thinking, as if everything in the world can be that way, which has allowed for the idea of definitions to just everything is defined. We know everything, we can define everything. And it's just like, that isn't our experience in the world. Anyone who stops and takes some time to really evaluate their own experience in the world can find that it is much less precise, much less well-defined. There's a lot of uncertainty that always remains every time that we're dealing with other real people and when we're interacting with the world. And your life is better, you're better able to live life when your map, your expectations are truer to the world that you're experiencing. Because you will be disappointed less, you will be frustrated less, you will be surprised less, to be completely honest, because all of those are when your expectations are not met in one way or another. And so the better we understand the world around us and the more truly that we can see it, part of that is even being careful when we're describing it to ourselves, the better we're able to live in the world. And I think that is in some senses a concept, or at least a part of what it is to grow in wisdom, which is knowing how to do the right thing or what the right thing to do is, not just being smart or having a list of facts about things.
Well, so I'm a little unclear here. So let me just run this by you and see where we're at. So if a definition is the one that is more precise.
Well, I don't know quite if I would say it's more precise. It has a hard boundary.
Okay.
I think I might have been imprecise with my own language.
Okay, so
why we work on this.
A definition is something that has a hard boundary that sets it apart from other things.
Yeah.
And then when we're thinking about doing life, when our map of the world is closer to the reality that we're facing, there are fewer surprises, and life is theoretically going to go a little bit better for us, barring any obstacles in the way, and any,
of course, which there will always be,
and all of that.
Yeah.
And in order to have that map line up with the territory, that's an area of, seems like an area of definition. And yet you're talking about the relationality of description being more human.
Yeah.
And so
yeah, so how does it map?
Yeah.
So I think definitions and descriptions are, at least the way that I think of them, are like modes. They require different modes of relating to them. But I think that both definitions and descriptions are trying to be true, right? They're seeking to be true, to be truthful about the thing that they're describing. So in the mode of specificity being an act of being truthful, both of them fit into that world of being truthful about the world. So in my map of the world that I relate to, I have definitions and descriptions, and they both are under the bigger category of being true about the world, as to the best of my ability. And so they're not opposed in that way. They're opposed in that I relate to definitions as scientific type things, quantity type things, and I relate to descriptions as quality type things, relational type things, like but they're both still trying to be true all the time. Yeah.
So in a sense, it's sort of like McGilchrist's two hemispheres of the brain. Let's take the bird brain. The bird brain's two hemispheres. The one hemisphere is to see a clearly defined grain of wheat on the ground in the midst of a bunch of rocks. And it goes for that grain of wheat because it has that grain of wheat is defined for it. It is separated out from everything else. And the other side of the bird brain is aware of the entire environment around it, whether there are predators there. It has a description. It has a map, an internal map of the external environment and whether or not there is danger there or opportunity. And that's the other hemisphere of the brain. And they're working together to achieve an aim.
Because those are both maps. They're just different types of maps, right? They have slightly different qualities, but they're still the same. They're still both maps in a sense. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that that's really helpful.
Yeah,
And this is partly,
when he translates that out to the human level,
yeah,
the left hemisphere is the grasping with the right hand,
yeah,
being able to grab something or grasp an idea in the mind
yep,
because it's clearly defined.
yep,
And the right hemisphere is the more exploratory.
yeah,
Let's see what's out there. Let's see if we can figure out how to describe these things, to tell a story about the things in our
yeah.
life.
And this is why I am so blessed, because some of these connections in the mapping itself that I had of description and definition are being revealed to me as we talk. And so thank you, because this is awesome. And I love it so much. And it's very helpful because as we're going through it, it's like, yeah, that's right. That fits. That's the idea. But now I know it, now I know them more. So no, thank you. No, and I think you're right. And I think that that's a really good mapping. I find that McGilchrist's understanding is, it's so, it's hard. I don't know if it's even possible to exhaust it, right? All of the implications of the master and his emissary and the way that those relate to each other, as far as when we start looking at stories, and then but even more so when we start looking at our own experience. I feel like it's so true. And it's so deep. It's in almost everything. In fact, maybe not almost everything. It might just be in everything that we experience, really.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've said this before, and what do I know? I'm not a neuroscientist, but it seems to me that it's not that they are um let's say unequally yoked. I mean, the way he describes it is that the right hemisphere is the master and the left hemisphere is the emissary, but that the left hemisphere has evolutionarily decided recently that it is the master and it's trying to take over. Where I in my little pea brain, I see it more as a marriage.
Yeah.
Because to me, it's very similar to the way two partners in a marriage relate to
Yeah.
each other. And that in itself creates a kind of beneficial opposition
Yeah.
that can bring out new things that neither one would come up with on their own.
Yeah.
And so when they're working together, that's the best way that it can work together, even if there is some opponent processing going on.
Yeah.
That's a good thing in the end.
Yeah.
But I do think it's fascinating where McGilchrist says that the ultimately beneficial way is for whatever the left hemisphere has come up with to send it back through the right hemisphere for sort of like a processing in order to get the fullness of the idea.
Yeah.
And I see that in marriage too. I really do. I mean, but that doesn't mean that I mean, if I look at it in that frame, what I would be saying then, if I agreed with him, I would be saying, well, then women are the master and men are the servant. Go off with everything and bring it back to me.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, that may be the way that we write stories about it, because in the stories that we tell in our, at least in our culture, the story that we tell is that it's the woman behind the man that makes the man, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And but that doesn't mean that the woman is, in my mind, it doesn't mean that the woman is in any way superior to the man.
No.
It's just that the woman has certain gifts that can encourage the man to become all that he can be. And of course, the man has certain gifts that he can use to encourage the woman to be all that she can be.
Yeah. Well, and that's also because you're wise and you know that that's not how it actually works. There are plenty of people today who do think that, or plenty of women and even some men who think that women are superior to men in kind of some sort of universal and unequivocal manner. And that's just ridiculous. The idea that there is a better when God made them both in his image, male and female, he created them, is absolutely ridiculous. But also the idea that we're undifferentiable and that we should be treated identically is also equally ridiculous. Your own experience shows. And yeah, My parents have been married for 35 years, and I have gotten to see lots of ups and downs and lots of strengths and weaknesses across their marriage. And it's been a huge blessing to me. And I think that you're absolutely right. There is this back and forth, and then these different strengths. And yeah, my brother got married less than a year ago as well. And I get together with him every week, and we just talk about how things are going and get dinner together. And one of the things that we talk about often is just like, my wife is so different than I am. And it's like, yes, she is. And that's a good thing. And that's a good thing. And trying to encourage both of them, because I do know his wife very well as well. To let that be. And that actually comes back a little bit to the mapping, right? It's like, let things be the way that they are. Let your relation to them set your expectations rather than some wishful thinking that you have about how maybe it should be, so that you can be a good husband and you can love well, and you can be a good wife and you can love well. And where for a husband, maybe sometimes loving well looks like saying, no, don't do that, or things are going crazy, and providing the containment for the wife. Like, this, it's okay. I am here and it's safe. And then oftentimes in the other direction for a wife, it's encouraging or enabling or drawing out the husband to do more than maybe he thinks that he can. And you can see beautiful growing in all sorts of different ways that are asymmetric. And asymmetric because of our differences, while still unifying us in our similarity. And then, like, for them, and especially, you know, their ultimate aim is to draw personally closer to Christ, and to be a facilitation for their spouse to grow closer to Christ in their life, and to look more like the image of Christ. Just more and more. And yeah, I think that's really true, and it's really important. And it's hard today. It's harder than it should be. I think it's probably always harder than it should be, but I mean, the stories that are being told now are really encouraging separation between men and women. And that's, you know, a whole other topic that, you know, has already had hundreds and thousands of hours of discussion and pages written about it, but it is a difficult thing.
Well, I mean, that feeds right into your idea about definition. When this is why both are needed, right? I mean, both science and faith are needed.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you can say science and religion if you want to, or science and faith, but both definition and description are needed, because
Yes.
if you give up on definition, then you're giving up on this. You use the word differentiability. You have just a continuum.
Yeah.
You have a continuum, then nothing can ever be.
Yes, that's
Nothing
right.
can exist if you have a continuum.
Yes.
You can say, oh, well, you know, the difference between men and women is a continuum, and you can be anywhere along that continuum if you want, Well,
Yeah. No.
no, I mean, this was the great discovery of quantum mechanics, that the universe isn't continuous, that it's made up of countable bits.
Yes.
Because there has to be some place where you can stop and say, this is where I am.
Yep.
And if you don't have that, then you truly are living in some sort of utopian vision of your own making, because, and there's no way you can relate to the actual real world if you haven't got a definition. Now, you know, they've decided over the last 10 years whether you have 2 definitions or 13 definitions or 52 definitions, you know. And then some people say that there's really no definitions, you can pick whatever you want, but
no, that's super helpful, actually, because that's a great example, right? I think you have men and you have women that are 2 different things, that we can define those, we know what they are. But then you have masculinity and femininity, and these are not things that can be defined. They can only be described.
They can only be described. Yeah.
And every man and every woman has some amount of both of them in them.
Exactly.
And that's always true. Even when it's 99.9 way out to forever of like the most macho guy that you like, most masculine guy that you've ever seen, there's still some part of him it has the femininity within him, always.
Well, and it's contextual.
And exactly. And what
right?
it looks like is absolutely contextual. And
Because
so
maybe
that's
where it will
where,
show up is in
yeah,
something like the way that they talk to their dog,
yes,
right?
yes,
They use
exactly.
baby talk with the dog,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
This macho guy, and he's got the dog, oh, boo, 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 boo.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, or sometimes and then the same thing for femininity. It's mirrored, right?
Mhm,
And it might be that no one else ever sees it, but it might be that their spouse sees it,
mhm,
where there's a line that she will not absorb or fold underneath or whatever, but she has a hard line, which is a very masculine thing to have a hard line and say this is the hard line. But it's only for him. It's still there. It'll always be there. And like letting those two things, letting male and female and or men and women and letting masculinity and femininity be different things and understood differently is super helpful, I think, for us to live rightly in the world that we find ourselves in. Because
mhm,
so much of the discussion about that gets messy is basically conflating those two ideas as if they're the same type of thing, or as if they're pointing all the same thing. And it gets
mhm.
messy. And I really like, I don't know if you've ever seen him anywhere, but Thomas Bogardus, he's a Catholic philosopher.
How
He's
do you
been
spell the
on,
last name?
it's Bogardus. He did a bunch of stuff with Capturing Christianity several years ago, and he's been on some other stuff. He also had a really famous, in certain circles of YouTube, debate with Vosh, and he got known as the eight water guy or something. And it's hours of description, but basically talking about definitions and what things are in philosophy. They got hung up on H2O and water, and that was really it was silly, but he did a good job. But the way that he describes male and female is that they're like shoes, which I thought was really interesting. You have a left shoe and you have a right shoe, and the way that human biology can represent that is there's only four combinations. You can have a left shoe, you can have a right shoe, you can have no shoes, or you can have both shoes. And no shoes and both shoes are different versions of intersex, which are extremely rare cases. But he lays it out in that way. And then part of what's helpful about that is it takes away this discussion of continuum because these are discrete,
Mhm,
right? There's only these. There's only these. And trying to say that these no shoes and double shoes means that left shoe and right shoe don't exist is ridiculous. So yeah, he's laid that out in writing, and then he's laid that argument out in a couple of interviews that he's done. And I think it's actually really helpful.
I will look him up. Yeah, it sounds interesting.
Yeah. So I want to go to one other thing, and then we'll see where it goes from there, which is obvious.
Yeah,
And
I
it's
was
kind of
hoping,
fun
I'm hoping we'd get there. Yeah.
because you used it a couple of times as we've talked so far. And when I heard it, I was like, yep, it still matches. It still matches. So I think an interesting idea that I had, and this was another one, it's so weird. I start thinking about things and then I just think about it a little bit here and a little bit there, and then I might mention to someone, I've been thinking about this idea recently and I just don't know where it's going. And then, okay, then a few months later, I might talk to them again, and then we'll see if it gets somewhere else. But obvious is a fun one. I was actually at church, a retreat, and I was walking back to our sleeping arrangements when I had this realization. But for something to be obvious, one of the things that means is that you already know it. Something being obvious means that you already know it. And that is not obvious when we consider the way that we use the word obvious. Oftentimes, the way that we use the word obvious as if there's something outside of us that is forcing itself into our knowing. It's out there and it's making us know it by its existence. And in reality, things are only obvious when we already know them, and know even in almost a relational sense some as well, not purely in an intellectual sense. And so the best example that I have of this is when you're a little kid and your mom sends you to the pantry to pull something out of the pantry. She says, go get me the mustard. It's about at your eye level, just open it up, reach in, grab it, bring it back to me in the kitchen. and you walk over, you've never seen it before, you've never related to it before, you don't know exactly what it looks like, she's described it to you, and you walk over, you open up the pantry and you look and you look and you look and you start moving stuff and you're looking and you can't find it. It's not there. You just can't see it. And so you hang your head, you go back, and you say, don't tell me it's not there. I know it's there. If I go find it, you know, you're going to get a punishment, let's say. And so you go back and you are desperate. You are looking with every effort that you can possibly make. And you can't find the thing that she's looking for. It can be a fridge, it can be a pantry, it can be whatever. And then she walks over, reaches in and pulls it out right in front of you. And you look at it and now you can see it. Now you know it. Now it's obvious that it was right there the whole time. But you didn't know it enough for it to be obvious to you beforehand. And I think that this is true, not only, I think this is true in our physical experience. I had this like really weird experience of this watching Formula One, where in Formula One, there's the fastest drivers, whatever, but they have this like U-shaped foam support that goes behind their shoulders. And in order to get out of the cockpit of the car, they have to pick it up every time. And my brother was the one that I was watching it with. He was explaining to me, they have different materials and it's really cool. And he knows I like materials because I work in manufacturing. And he was just like, they have different, stiffness depending on the temperature and all this kind of stuff. And it's really cool. And then they look kind of pink, and he was describing their shape. And then we ended up pausing for something else. And there was one on the screen. And he said, look, it's right there. Look, it's right there. He's describing it to me. No, behind him. And it's like that. And I like stood up, walked up to the TV, and I just didn't know it well enough that I couldn't even see it. Part of it is like, you can't even see things that you don't know. And part of things being obvious is the things that you can see. They're not outside of you forcing themselves into you. It is a relationship of you knowing them. That is what makes things obvious. And then I could see it, and then I knew. And now every time I see it, it's obvious to me that that's what it is. I can always see it every time that they're showing them in the garage or whatever, or they crash and they got to get out, and I can see it. And I think that this is true not only for things that are obvious to us in our physical experience, but things that are obvious to us that we can see when we're considering different ideas. For a lot of women, it's obvious when two people are interested in each other, a young boy and a young girl. For almost all men, it is not obvious at all. And this is a great example, I think, right? They know those signs. They know those things, and they can see them by knowing them in a way that you can't, that men, generally speaking, don't see them. And then even for like ideas and connections, well, it's, some people say, but isn't it obvious? It's like, what do you mean? Well, it was obvious to the man from Japan that you were like a slob because you let your laundry pile up to make 2 loads worth. That's obvious because that's what he knows. He knows that a proper person who's taking care of their space and their clothes washes it regularly. That's what he knows. So that's obvious. So anyway, it's not that obvious is only a synonym for things that we know, but it's that the insight that I had, and I think that it holds true, is that in order for something to be obvious, you have to already know it. And then I think that that's kind of interesting.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's sort of the way perception works anyway. You can't perceive something
unless you know it.
Unless you know it.
Yep, that's right.
Or unless you're expecting it. You may have never seen it before, but if somebody explains it to you
enough, you can get like this like half-formed idea of what it is, where you sort of know it, but then the experience like crystallizes it. Yeah, absolutely.
But then I think there's another aspect of obvious that maybe you can help me work out because you're a man.
Yeah.
So sometimes when I'm in conversation with my husband, I'll say something in the making of conversation, and he'll say, why do you have to say something so obvious?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, to me, sometimes I say something that is obvious because I think that it sort of sets a foundation for the rest of the conversation.
Yes.
Let's set out our assumptions, right? it doesn't seem necessary to me to say, okay, I'm going to say something obvious now in order to set out my assumption.
Yeah.
I just say it.
Yeah.
But why would that be offensive to a man to hear
Oh,
something
that's
that's
interesting.
obvious?
I'm not sure, actually, because I think that going back to kind of where I started, I think that sometimes making explicit things that are implicit is worth doing in order to get rid of the fog, to eliminate the possibility of uncertainty.
But is a man
So
sometimes offended because he might think you're saying something, you think I don't know that thing, and that's why
there
you're
can
saying
be
it.
an additional implication of it's like, yeah, they absolutely. And one of the interesting things that I've learned, and actually I worked through this with my family, um, and working through it from an angle of specificity of language, is that the way that pride looks in men and women is wildly different. Like the way that men experience and like participate in and like live out pride, it looks so different than the way that women do it. Men want it to be about them. They want their attention. They want their recognition. They want all of those things. That's what pride looks like. It's much more direct and much more kind of focused. Generalizations, of course. Um, and so whenever that's challenged, that idol of pride is can cause for someone to lash out in a way that's different. Whereas, pride doesn't look exactly that way in women.
Say more.
Well, I actually don't want to say more because I can speak very confidently about what pride looks like in myself and in men that I know, that I have like walked alongside with for accountability and for prayer and through confession and through help trying to counsel them to grow. I have not had that experience with women, and I don't want to put my foot in my mouth. I'm going to say that I will
For the sake of
silence the,
specificity, you will refrain.
yeah, well, yeah, I'm not just, but I'm, yeah, I don't think it would be appropriate. Um, there might be a time where I've walked through that in a way that I could speak on it comfortably, but I mean, I'm not married. I don't have daughters. I don't have women for whom the confidence and like the care and the counsel and the direct experience is something that would build up that understanding for me. I have a sister and I have a mother. It's not the same as kind of some of those other relationships where I might grow in my understanding in a way that I could speak on it confidently or with some certainty.
Well,
I don't know. Would you be willing to
yeah,
explain what you think
yeah,
pride
I'm
looks like in
reluctant to
women?
speak on it because I haven't really reflected on it that much, but it does seem to me like it's in some ways it's sort of inside out from the way you described it for a man.
Yeah.
Um, because I don't think it rises up in a woman in quite the same way where it's all bristling, because my
Yeah.
pride has been offended. It's more needing to be seen as being knowledgeable, I guess. Needing to be seen as
Would influential be a word that might be appropriate?
well,
I'm not sure because
I don't think it's
influence,
not one of my words. I mean,
yeah,
I didn't say it's one of my words.
fair enough.
In may and maybe it shows up differently in different people. I'm sure
Oh,
it
of
does.
course.
I'm always going back to the garden and I'm thinking about Eve. And so partly it's maybe my description of what happened with Eve, my story that I tell about Eve is that
Yeah.
she lost her trust in the goodness of God.
Yeah.
When the enemy spoke to her and said, did God really say this?
Yeah.
Then the questions start up, and if she lost her trust in the goodness of God, then she's got to take care of things for herself.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happens in marriage often. If a woman
Mm.
loses her trust in the goodness of her husband,
Yes.
then she needs to start taking control of things on her own.
Yeah.
And it's that taking control
Mhm.
that kind of manipulating thing that maybe
Yeah.
that's the way that pride shows up, I think, for
Right.
some women.
Oh,
I
yeah.
know it's something
Okay.
that I have to fight against all the time, is not trying to manipulate with my language or trying to manipulate even with my behavior, like in
Mhm.
the giving of gifts or in the giving of service,
Mhm.
to do that for a purpose rather than to just do it out of sheer love,
Mm.
and to always be assessing, what's my intention here?
Yeah.
Because and the thing that makes it complicated is that oftentimes your intentions are messed up, but if you listen to the enemy and the enemy says, oh, you're just doing this because you're trying to manipulate people,
Yeah.
and then you don't do it,
Then there's
then
good
you're
that isn't coming into the world.
yes, then you're
Yeah.
not doing this service,
Yeah.
right? So you have to learn to tune out the enemy's voice and just do the thing you know to be right, and then not get yourself all tangled up in
The
this.
fact that it's not perfect.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because yeah, one of the things is like what's the difference between manipulating someone and influencing someone? And really, at least to my understanding, the big difference between those two things is basically connotation, or is like is it for their good or is it for your own good? Is it
Mhm,
selfless or is it selfish? Is
mhm.
kind of one of the ways that those might be differentiated. And maybe
Yeah.
for some people, those words aren't the perfect words in the way that it differentiates, but it's hard because it's like the exact same thing based off of your own heart posture can be one thing or another. And it's part of what makes it difficult. And I mean, it comes back sometimes. I come back sometimes to the Sermon on the Mount and think that the standard that Christ calls us to is impossible. Don't even think incorrectly ever. That's what it is to be perfect. And we know that that's not possible. We know that in this world there is always imperfection. And so instead, how can we love well? Christ himself is also the one who says, love God and love others. And when you're doing those things, then you are fulfilling all of the law and the prophets. And so even in giving gifts or in giving advice or in providing care for family members or friends that you have, when it's for their good and it's for God's glory and it's in that mode of love, even though it's not perfect and even though it's whatever, it's still the right way to do it. And I do also think, like, I personally, and I could be way off of base on this, but I do think that old women should like meddle a little bit more than they do. I think that women with influence that comes from the life that they've lived should use that for good. Um, and it's a really tough thing to do it in a good way. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying like it should be easy because I understand that it isn't. But I think that the sphere of influence that a woman who's has a well-lived life has is really important, and it's also gigantic, and the ability to influence and kind of move things here and there, or afford opportunities for other people to kind of step into their own responsibility, growth, benefit is also a big thing, that partly because we're so spread out from our family and we don't know our local communities to the same extent, some of those kind of bonds and the places where that influence would be exercised has been removed. The arena itself has been removed. And then also because we've kind of somehow, for whatever reason that I don't fully understand, decided that that isn't something that we should do. And I do think that there's good that can be done there. Like I said, with the caveat that it's very easy to miss the mark by doing too much or turning into pure manipulation and like, well,
Mhm.
I know what's right, rather than, well, let me see what I can do to make an opportunity for this person, to, get a job, or to meet somebody else that they might benefit from knowing, whether it's like an older mentor or a friend or a romantic partner. Make an opportunity, and I think that that is something that is really the domain of, and kind of the purview of women who have lived much of their lives and been able to build up all of that influence. So yeah.
Well, I think one of the reasons I cringed when you said influence is that the word influence has kind of been destroyed in the world today, don't you think? with all
Yeah, well, the word
Instagram
influencer,
influencers and
I
right,
know. No, that's a
Facebook
good point.
influencers.
Yeah, I wonder what a better word is. Because there has to be a better word. But I'm just
Well,
not
maybe
sure of
we
one.
just need to recover. We need to,
Yeah,
you were talking at the beginning about how important language is.
yeah,
Before I get there, I do want to tell you a little story and then we can go back
yeah,
to the idea of language.
yeah.
This morning I was listening to Become New, which is one of my favorite daily devotionals. It's John Ortberg, and the last week or so, he's been talking about um, some of the great thinkers of the past, St.
Mhm,
Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, people like
mhm,
that. And today he was talking about Brother Lawrence.
mhm,
And he said, he just told one little story from Brother Lawrence that one of the things Brother Lawrence learned to do was that even when he's doing a small thing,
mhm,
maybe doing the dishes or maybe even mending a sock or something like
mhm.
that. When he finishes this small task, he lies face down on the floor and he says, "Thank you, God, for giving me the creativity and the
Mm,
strength and the energy to do that and give the
yeah,
glory to God over even all these small things," which is a
yeah,
constant reminder then. And you don't have to do it after everything you do, but just,
yeah,
on occasion as a reminder that none of this is from us.
yes,
Without him, we can do nothing.
yes,
And because that's where the pride gets in. The pride gets in there to say, I did this and look at
yes,
me,
yes.
looking over your shoulder. Did you notice that nice thing
Yeah,
I did?
exactly.
Right?
Yeah, totally. No,
Yeah.
I'm gonna keep us on the derail because
Yeah.
that's actually really I have a little anecdote there too, actually. I remember it was a very significant moment in my walk, in my following of Christ, where I can remember because it was something that when it happened, it stood out to me so much. But the first time that I got up, so I live, I have two siblings, and so as when we were growing up, and then like summers between college and all this stuff, we were all in the same house together. And so mom would always cook, and then one of the rest of us would clean the kitchen. That was just the way that it was. If she cooked, she didn't clean. So she would cook, and then one of us would clean. That was our routine. I know there's other houses that are set up differently, but that was ours. And often, Saturday morning, there would still be some dishes in the kitchen that needed to be cleaned and put away. And because of my schedule, I would be up early often. My dad and I both most often would be up the earliest. And so one of the things that I used to do somewhat regularly was on a Saturday morning, I'd get up, I'd go to the kitchen and I'd clean the kitchen. And I did that for years and years and years. And I remember God was really working in some other stuff in my life at that time and really growing and drawing me towards him. And I remember there was a Saturday where I got up and I went and I cleaned the kitchen and I didn't grumble in my heart the whole time. I did it with a posture of gratitude and thankfulness for the opportunity to love my family. And it was just the most wonderful thing. And because I'm human, it didn't always be like that from then on forever. But I have never forgotten that day and that morning and how it was a step of God allowing me to experience that is his grace to me and a loving thing. And what you were talking about just really reminded me of that. Like the more that we can remind ourselves of that, the better it is for us to maintain a posture of humility because there is no such thing as too much humility. There's too much false humility. There's too much like fake kind of versions of it. But real humility isn't looking at yourself, it's looking at others more and not looking at yourself at all. And looking at others more, if we're loving God and we're loving others, if that's what our life is all about, then when we're looking outwards, we're always in a posture of humility when we're doing it properly. So,
Mhm.
anyway, yeah.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. So, well, to wrap up, let's go back to this idea of language.
Yes.
And how language preforms our thinking.
And reclaiming language, is it something that's possible? That's an interesting thought there too, with the word influence in particular. Yeah. I think, words come and go. That's actually one of the interesting things about words. Anyone who says, well, it meant this then, and that's what it's like, no, that's not how language works. Language means what it means at the time that it is and with the people that are using it, and that's just how it is. And I don't know. I don't know exactly how well we'll be able to reclaim certain words. Sometimes we might need to come up with new ones. I mean, I do think as we're talking right now,
we've lost a lot of good words.
we have, and actually English is one of the languages where you can trace a lack of specificity creeping into the language over time, actually, over the hundreds of years that it's been used and as it's been so popular. There used to be different versions of the second person pronoun that had more specificity built into them. There used to be a lot of more language that kind of broke things down into their to different types of things, that now there's only one word that gets used for a lot of them. It's actually, particularly as I was learning, like for Spanish, it stood out to me how asymmetrical it is that there's one word in English that has multiple words in Spanish, at least two, and how rare it is for there to only be one word in Spanish that has multiple words in English. It almost always goes the other way. And it is something with English that's difficult. I think it's part of like what I've been encouraged as I've been working through this is for anyone who has an opportunity. I do think learning another language is really helpful in this practice of learning how to use language well and to be specific with it, because it reveals to you how language works. You can like study the laws and how all the rules are different and grammar is different and vocabulary is different all you want. But speaking two languages puts you in a mode, or reading two languages, whatever it looks like in your experience, really you get a better feel for it than you can otherwise. And yeah. And then for myself, I will continue to be specific most of the time with my language, and I will strive for that. And when I fail, I'll fail, and I'll try and learn, and I'll let other people point it out, and I'll encourage it in those that I know and love and care about. And that's about as much as I can hold myself accountable to, and then we'll see if, I know that other people are thinking in similar ways. I mean, like you mentioned, connecting it to the idea of Peterson's of, tell the truth, or at least don't lie. But I'm not sure exactly what it'll look like in the end. But it's an idea that I felt was valuable, and I knew that I wanted to talk to you about it. And talking to you helped me develop these ideas even more, and has been super beneficial for me as well. So I want to just say thank you.
But it's sure been fun. And before we go, I want to mention for people who want to dig a little deeper into this idea of how language changes over time and how we're losing some of our specificity in English. There's a great book that came out, I think it was in the 80s. It's called Less Than Words Can Say by Richard Mitchell. Richard Mitchell wrote a column for many years called The Underground Grammarian. And in Less Than Words Can Say, he especially shows up the power that language can have, and how easy it is to destroy the power of language. And he shows a speech by Winston Churchill that empowered the entire British nation to rise up and fight off Nazism, and contrasts it with a grant application for some bureaucracy and the kind of meaningless language that gets fed to us in all this bureaucraties, right? And how we're tending more and more and more towards the bureaucratic language, and further away from the beautiful inspirational power that language can have, especially when it's specific and refined and condensed. I mean, that's one of the things I notice, is that when you look back at the old writers, they can say more in one sentence than we can say in an entire paragraph, right?
Yeah. And part of that is because each word means something, and they all mean something together as well, and you know what it is.
Mhm.
And there's real power in that, for sure.
Yep. Well, if anybody else wants to jump in on the conversation, let us know in the comments, and William and I will take you on in a second
Yeah.
round.
Yes, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, really good talking to you, William. Look forward to the next time.
Yeah.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.